Let's begin with a very strange experiment. I want you, just for a moment, to stop thinking of yourself as a thing that is in the world and start wondering whether you might actually be something the world is doing. Not a noun, a verb, not a lump of stuff that got dropped into existence and now has to make the best of it, but something more like a wave, a temporary, particular, absolutely unrepeatable shape that the ocean is making right now for the sheer entertainment of making it. Because that's really what we're going to talk about tonight, or rather, what we're going to play with, since talking about it too seriously rather defeats the purpose. The subject is this curious old instruction that keeps turning up in one form or another in every tradition that ever took itself half seriously, and then thankfully stopped. Act as if God is within you. Now notice immediately the strangeness of that phrase. It doesn't say believe that God is within you. It doesn't say prove that God is within you, which is a relief, because you could spend several lifetimes on that project and get precisely nowhere, the way a knife tries to cut itself or an eye tries to see itself. It says, act as if, which means we're being invited into a kind of theater, a kind of play, and I use that word in both senses because it turns out they're the same sense. Let's take these one at a time, slowly, the way you'd peel an onion if you had nowhere else to be. First, what could it possibly mean for God to be within a person? The whole history of theology, East and West, has wobbled back and forth on this question like a drunk on a tightrope. On one side, you have the view that God is way out there, up in the sky, beyond the stars, sitting on some unimaginably distant throne, running the universe the way a slightly bored engineer runs a factory, occasionally sending down memos in the form of miracles or commandments. This is God as the great foreman. He is emphatically not you. You are the creature, he is the creator. And the whole relationship is modeled, rather unfortunately if you ask me, on that between a potter and a pot. The pot does not get to ask questions. The pot certainly does not get to imagine that it might, in some sense, be the potter wearing a temporary disguise. But there's this other current, much older in some ways, that runs underneath almost every mystical tradition like a river under a city. It shows up in the Upanishads as Tattvam Asi. Thou art that. It shows up in certain strands of Christian mysticism, in people who got themselves into serious trouble with the authorities for saying things like, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. It shows up in Sufism, in Taoism, in Zen. And what all of these traditions are fumbling toward in their different vocabularies is the same outrageous suggestion, that the separation between you and the divine ground of the universe is not a fact. It's a feeling. It's a very convincing feeling, granted. About as convincing as the feeling that the sun goes around the earth, which it certainly seems to do, every single day, right in front of your eyes. But a feeling nonetheless, not a fact. So when we're told to act as if God is within us, I think what's being pointed at is this. Stop waiting for someone to hand you a certificate proving your divinity. Stop treating this as a metaphysical dispute to be settled by argument, the way lawyers settle property disputes. Just try on the costume. See what happens when you walk around. For one day, as if the very energy that spun galaxies into being were also at this very moment sitting behind your eyes, reading these words, breathing your breath. You'll notice something almost immediately, which is that your first instinct is to feel this is arrogant, blasphemous even. Who am I to imagine that I've got God rattling around inside me like loose change in a pocket? And this reaction is worth paying very close attention to, because it tells you something important about how thoroughly you've been trained by centuries of a particular kind of religious anxiety, to think of yourself as fundamentally separate from and inferior to whatever it is that runs the show. But turn the question around. What exactly do you think you're made of? Not metaphorically, literally. Every atom in your body was cooked in the heart of a star that exploded billions of years before the Earth even existed. The calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the oxygen you're breathing right now, all of it is recycled stardust, rearranged by an unbroken chain of processes stretching back to the very beginning of everything. If there was a beginning, which is itself a rather dubious idea we'll come back to. You did not arrive in the universe, you grew out of it, the way an apple grows out of an apple tree. And nobody in their right mind looks at an apple and says, How curious that a piece of fruit should show up on a tree that has nothing to do with fruit. The tree apples, that's one of the things it does. And in exactly the same way, the universe peoples. You are not a stranger who wandered in from outside. You are the cosmos, temporarily curled up into a shape that can look at itself and wonder what it is. This is really the whole secret, if you want to call it a secret, though it's been shouted from rooftops by mystics for thousands of years and somehow still manages to sound like news. You are not a thing that is in the universe, the way a marble is in a box. You are a behavior of the universe, the way a wave is a behavior of the ocean. And when we ask, does God exist within this person? We're asking a slightly confused question, rather like asking, does the ocean exist within this wave? Of course it does. Where else would it be? There's nowhere else for it to be. The wave isn't a container that happens to have some ocean poured into it. The wave is the ocean, doing something momentarily wave-shaped. And when the wave subsides, the ocean doesn't lose anything, because the ocean was never actually two things to begin with. Now, I can already hear the objection forming, and it's a good one. So let's take it seriously rather than brushing it aside. If I am the universe and you are the universe, and that fellow over there causing all sorts of trouble is also somehow the universe, then why on earth does it feel like we're separate? Why do I feel like me, stuck inside this particular body, looking out at all of you through two small holes, utterly convinced that my thoughts are private, my pain is mine alone, my death will be a genuine ending rather than some cosmic non-event? This is where it gets interesting, because the answer isn't that the feeling of separateness is a mistake to be corrected. It's not that you're doing something wrong by feeling like an individual. The feeling of being a separate self is itself part of the game. In fact, it may be the most essential part of the game. Think of it this way. If you play hide and seek, the whole point of the game absolutely depends on someone hiding well enough that the seeking becomes genuinely difficult, even a little frightening. If the person hiding simply stood in plain view the entire time, waving, there would be no game at all, just an awkward standoff. The delight of hide and seek, the delicious tension of it, comes precisely from forgetting, temporarily and on purpose, where the hider actually is. And I want to suggest, playfully, because this whole subject really does deserve to be handled playfully rather than solemnly, that this is more or less what the universe is up to. It is playing an enormous, staggeringly elaborate game of hide and seek with itself. It hides so well in each and every one of us that it genuinely, thoroughly forgets. It forgets so completely that it starts to panic. It starts to believe that this hiding, this temporary, local, thoroughly convincing performance of being a separate ego trapped in a bag of skin is the whole truth of the matter. And out of that forgetting comes an enormous amount of what we call human suffering, the anxiety of feeling cut off, the desperate grasping after security, the fear of death, which is really just the fear of the hiding spot being discovered, or rather of having to come out and rejoin the game. So here is the first thing to notice about acting as if God is within you. It doesn't mean pretending you are somehow exempt from being a particular limited mortal creature with a name and a story and a body that will eventually wear out. That's not the invitation at all. It means recognizing that this particular limited performance, you exactly as you are, with your worries and your quirks and your unfinished business, is not a mistake, not a fall from grace, not an unfortunate accident that needs correcting. It is the universe's own handiwork, done with total conviction. The way a jazz musician throws total conviction into a phrase that will exist for 3 seconds and never be repeated in quite that way again. There is an old Zen story. I won't tell it exactly right, because these stories are meant to be retold badly. That's part of their charm. About a monk who goes to his teacher absolutely bursting with a question he's been carrying around for years, and he says, "What is the Buddha?" And the teacher, who is in the middle of hauling water or fixing a fence or doing whatever mundane thing needed doing, looks up and says something like, "The cypress tree in the garden." And the monk, naturally, is furious, because he wanted a cosmic answer and got a tree. But of course, that is the cosmic answer. The teacher isn't being evasive. He's pointing out that the divine isn't hiding behind ordinary things, waiting to be unveiled by the correct metaphysical password. The divine is the ordinary thing seen properly. It's the cypress tree. It's the sound of water being hauled. It's you, sitting there right now, slightly uncomfortable in your chair, wondering where this speech is headed. Now let's talk about what actually changes when you take this as if seriously. Not as a doctrine you sign up for, but as an experiment you conduct with your own life, starting today, starting this evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. The first thing that changes is your relationship to fear. Most of what we call anxiety is, when you look closely at it, the fear of loss. Loss of security, loss of love, loss of status, ultimately loss of life itself. And all of that fear is built on a single, mostly unexamined assumption, that you are a separate, isolated thing, standing alone against an indifferent universe that might at any moment snuff you out. But if you take seriously, even just as a working hypothesis, that you are not separate from the process that is doing the whole show, that your birth and your death are simply the universe's way of breathing in and breathing out, the way waves rise and fall without the ocean losing a single drop, then the fear doesn't necessarily disappear, but it loosens its grip. It becomes less like a rope around your neck and more like weather. Something that passes through you rather than something that defines you. I think of it sometimes like this. Imagine the universe as an enormously long piece of music, unfolding over billions of years, and you are one particular passage in that music, a few bars, let's say, with your own melody, your own rhythm, your own key signature. Now, a piece of music isn't trying to arrive at its final note. If it were, the best musicians would just play the last note of every symphony as quickly as possible and skip the rest, which would obviously be absurd. The whole point of the music is the playing of it, the unfolding of it note by note. And the ending, far from being a tragedy, is what gives the whole thing its shape, its meaning, its beauty. A piece of music that went on forever, that never resolved, wouldn't be music at all. It would just be noise. Your death, seen this way, is not a war you're racing toward in dread. It's the final cadence that gives your particular melody its shape. And once you stop grasping so desperately at extending the piece forever, once you stop treating every passing moment as a threat, something to be defended against, you find rather unexpectedly that you can actually hear the music. You can actually enjoy the phrase you're in the middle of playing instead of spending the whole performance anxious about the ending. The second thing that changes, when you act as if the divine is within rather than somewhere far off requiring your desperate pursuit, is your relationship to your own worth. So much suffering in ordinary life comes from a kind of chronic, low-grade sense that you're not quite enough, not accomplished enough, not good enough, not spiritual enough, not thin enough, not rich enough, not anything enough. And that somewhere out there, if you just work hard enough, achieve enough, purify yourself enough, you might finally earn your way into being worthy of love, worthy of belonging, worthy of the universe's approval. But notice the peculiar logic of this. If God is genuinely within you, not standing outside evaluating you like some cosmic examiner marking papers, then this entire project of earning worthiness becomes rather comic, like a person searching frantically all over the house for their glasses, which are perched the whole time on top of their own head. You cannot earn what you already are. You cannot achieve your way into being the very ground out of which achieving arises in the first place. It would be like a wave trying to earn its way into being wet. This doesn't mean, by the way, that effort is pointless or that ambition is somehow spiritually inferior to lounging about doing nothing. That's a common and rather lazy misreading of this whole outlook. The wave still rises, still crashes, still does all the vigorous wave-like things a wave does. The point isn't to stop acting. It's to stop acting from the assumption that you're fundamentally deficient and need to fix yourself before you're allowed to belong. You act instead the way a child plays, with total seriousness in the moment, total investment in the game, but without the crushing metaphysical burden of believing that the entire meaning of existence hinges on winning. There's a marvelous kind of freedom that opens up here, and I want to be honest that it can feel at first almost dangerous. Because if you're not striving to earn your way into worthiness, what's stopping you from simply doing whatever you please? Isn't this just a fancy spiritual excuse for selfishness? It's a fair question, and every tradition that has ever pointed toward this kind of freedom has had to wrestle with people who heard you are already divine and concluded, therefore I can behave like an absolute menace and it doesn't matter. But here's the thing, and this is really the heart of the whole matter, when you actually genuinely feel your connection to everything else. Rather than merely believing it as an abstract doctrine, cruelty becomes almost physically difficult, the way it's difficult to slam your own hand in a door on purpose. If the person across from you is not fundamentally other than you, if you're both waves on the same ocean, both bars in the same enormous symphony, then harming them isn't a moral rule you're obeying out of fear of punishment. It's simply nonsensical, like a hand attacking itself. The ethics doesn't come from outside as a list of commandments enforced by threat. It comes from inside, as a natural consequence of no longer experiencing yourself as fundamentally isolated from everyone else. This is, I think, why so many people who have had some kind of profound mystical opening, whether through long practice or through some sudden unexpected grace, or these days sometimes through means that are a good deal quicker and considerably less advisable, report the same basic after effect. Not a sudden acquisition of superpowers, not the ability to predict the future or read minds, just an overwhelming, almost embarrassingly simple sense of tenderness toward everything, including the parts of themselves they used to despise. Because if God is within you, then God is also within your anxiety, within your anger, within your most humiliating and hidden failures. Nothing gets left out of the invitation. The whole point of within is that it doesn't come with an asterisk excluding the messy parts. Let's pause here and think about the word act, because I don't want us to breeze past it. Acting is what actors do. What does an actor do? An actor takes on a role, throws themselves into it completely, cries real tears if the part calls for tears, feels real terror if the part calls for terror. And yet, underneath all of that total commitment, never actually forgets, not really, that they are also the person who will walk off stage when the curtain falls and go have a sandwich. The greatest actors are not the ones who forget entirely that they are acting. They're the ones who can hold both truths simultaneously. Total absorption in the role and total awareness that it is, after all, a role. This is exactly the balance being pointed to when we're told to act as if God is within us, rather than being handed some doctrine to recite. You are invited to throw yourself completely into your life, your particular circumstances, your particular relationships, your particular struggles and joys, with the same total commitment a great actor brings to a part. Feel the grief when grief comes. Feel the joy when joy comes. Don't hold back from any of it in some misguided effort to seem spiritually detached, floating 3 feet above your own experience like a person too enlightened to bother getting their hands dirty. That's not wisdom. That's just a rather sad kind of numbness, dressed up in spiritual language. But underneath all of that total engagement, there is this other awareness, quietly present, like a bass note underneath a melody, that you are also the vast, playful, indestructible process putting on this particular performance. When the curtain eventually falls, and it will, for every single one of us without exception, no matter how carefully we eat or how devotedly we meditate, you are not simply annihilated. The ocean does not stop existing because a particular wave has completed its journey to the shore. Let's turn now to something practical, because all of this can start to sound rather abstract if we're not careful, and I promised you this would be an experiment, not a lecture. How, concretely, does a person go about acting as if God is within them? I don't think it requires temples or robes or years of study in a monastery, though there's certainly nothing wrong with any of those things if they appeal to you. I think it starts with something much simpler and much stranger, which is paying very close attention to what is actually happening right now. In this room, in this moment, rather than the endless commentary running in your head about what happened 5 minutes ago or what might happen 5 minutes from now. Notice, for instance, that you did not choose to be breathing. Right now, as you sit there, your lungs are filling and emptying without any instruction from the part of you that thinks of itself as you, the part that plans, worries, remembers, judges. Something is breathing you. Your heart is beating without your permission and without your supervision, at a rate of about 100,000 beats a day. And it has been doing this since before you were even born, without a single moment's rest. And it will keep doing it right up until the very last second of your life, whenever that comes. Who is doing that? Not the part of you that reads the newspaper and worries about the mortgage. Something else, something considerably older and wiser and more competent than your conscious planning mind, which can barely remember where it left its car keys. I would suggest, again playfully as an experiment rather than a dogma, that this something else is exactly what people throughout history have been pointing to when they talked about the divine within. Not some ghostly figure with a beard hovering just behind your rib cage. Just this, the intelligence that grows your fingernails, that heals a cut without needing to be told how skin regenerates, that turns the food you eat into the very cells reading these words right now, that somehow orchestrated the growth of an entire human being out of 2 microscopic cells without any conscious effort on your part whatsoever. This intelligence is not separate from you, waiting outside to be summoned. It is quite literally running the show, and has been the whole time, usually without so much as a thank you note. So here's a practical suggestion offered lightly. Take it or leave it. The next time you catch yourself in the grip of some anxious spiral, worrying about a conversation that hasn't happened yet, replaying an embarrassment from years ago, rehearsing arguments with people who aren't even in the room, try, just for a moment, dropping down out of that noisy, chattering, planning mind and into the simple fact of your own breathing. Not controlling it, not trying to breathe more spiritually, whatever that would even mean. Just noticing that it's happening, that it has been happening this whole time, that something in you knows exactly how to do this without any help from your worried, striving ego. And in that moment of noticing, you are, in a very real sense, acting as if God is within you, because you are shifting your attention, even briefly, from the anxious little performer to the vast, competent, endlessly patient process that is actually doing the heavy lifting of keeping you alive. You don't have to believe anything in particular for this to work. You just have to pay attention. There's another practice related to this, which is noticing how much of your suffering comes not from what is actually happening, but from your running commentary about what is happening. Pain is one thing. Pain is simply information, the body's way of saying, attend to this. But suffering, the prolonged, exhausting, self-perpetuating kind, usually comes from the story wrapped around the pain. This shouldn't be happening. This always happens to me. What if this never ends? Strip away the commentary, and what's left is often surprisingly manageable. A sensation, an event, a wave passing through, rising and falling the way all waves do, given enough time. This is worth practicing, not because pain is somehow illusory. It isn't. And anyone who tells you your suffering isn't real is not worth listening to, but because acting as if the divine is within you means trusting, at some deep level, the same intelligence that grows your fingernails to also handle your grief, your fear, your disappointment, without your anxious ego constantly grabbing the wheel and insisting it knows better. There is a kind of relaxation available here that has nothing to do with passivity or resignation. It's closer to the relaxation of a swimmer who has finally stopped fighting the water and discovered that the water all along was perfectly willing to hold them up. Let's talk too about creativity, because I think this is one of the most direct and delightful ways that acting as if God is within you shows up in ordinary life. Think about what happens when you're genuinely absorbed in making something. Painting, cooking, building, gardening, playing music, even just having a really good, unguarded conversation with someone you trust. In those moments, notice that you're not really trying in the effortful, teeth-gritted way we usually associate with trying. Something takes over. The right word arrives before you've consciously searched for it. The brush moves before you've calculated where it should go. Musicians call this being in the pocket. Athletes call it flow. Writers call it the muse, and they're onto something with that word, because a muse in the old stories was never thought of as coming from inside the person's ordinary effortful ego. It was thought of as a visitation, something arriving from beyond the small self, using the person as an instrument. I would suggest that these moments of flow, of ease, of creation happening almost through you rather than by you, are glimpses, brief, unmistakable glimpses, of exactly what we're talking about tonight. In those moments, you're not laboring to manufacture something out of nothing, the way the anxious ego imagines creativity must work. You're getting out of the way and letting the same intelligence that arranges galaxies and grows oak trees out of acorns do a bit of arranging through your hands. This is, I think, the most honest and least dogmatic way to understand what it might mean for God to work through a person, not through pronouncements from a cloud, through the quiet, unforced arrival of exactly the right note. Now I want to address something that tends to worry people when they first encounter this way of looking at things, because I think it deserves an honest answer rather than a dismissive wave of the hand. If everything, including cruelty and suffering and disaster, is somehow part of this vast cosmic process, if God is within the murderer as much as within the saint, doesn't this collapse into a kind of moral shrug, where nothing really matters because everything is equally divine? I don't think so, and here's why. The fact that a wave and a whirlpool are both made of the same water doesn't mean there's no difference between drowning in a whirlpool and floating pleasantly on a calm sea. The ocean contains storms as well as stillness, and nobody sensible pretends the storms don't matter just because they're made of the same substance as everything else. What this way of seeing things changes is not whether suffering matters, it matters enormously, but where you locate the response to it. Instead of a distant, disapproving God up in the sky who occasionally, mysteriously allows terrible things to happen for reasons beyond your comprehension, you get a picture in which the response to suffering, the healing of it, the standing up against cruelty, the comforting of the grieving, all of that has to happen through us, because there isn't a separate divine hand reaching down from elsewhere to do it instead. If God is within you, then when you comfort someone who is suffering, that is not you doing a favor on God's behalf. That is quite directly the divine within one wave reaching out to steady another. This is, I think, a far more demanding vision than the old picture of a distant deity keeping score, because it puts the responsibility for kindness, for justice, for tenderness, squarely in our own hands right now, without the comfortable option of waiting for someone else, somewhere else, to eventually sort things out. Acting as if God is within you is not a permission slip for indifference. It's closer to being handed the keys. I want to come back, before we finish, to that phrase, as if, because I think it's the cleverest and most important part of the whole instruction, and it would be easy to miss why. Notice that we're not told act because you have definitively proven that God is within you, which would require a level of certainty that nobody, ever in the history of the species, has actually managed to produce in a way that satisfied everybody else. Metaphysical certainty of that kind is simply not on offer to anyone, and anybody who claims otherwise is, I'm afraid, selling something. Instead, we're given this much gentler, much wiser instruction. Act as if, which means you don't need to resolve once and for all whether this is literally, philosophically, scientifically true. You just need to notice what happens to your life, moment by moment, when you conduct the experiment. This is actually how most of the genuinely useful wisdom in the world works, if you look closely. Nobody ever proved, in the sense of a mathematical proof, that treating other people with kindness produces a better life than treating them with contempt. And yet, if you actually run the experiment, if you actually try for a sustained period, acting with generosity rather than suspicion, you find out empirically, in your own lived experience, that something shifts. The proof isn't philosophical, it's experiential. It's a proof you can only get by doing the thing, not by arguing about the thing. And that's exactly the invitation here. Nobody is asking you to sign a document declaring your absolute conviction that divinity resides within your particular ribcage. You're being invited to run an experiment, starting today, to walk through your ordinary life, your meetings and your traffic jams and your difficult conversations and your quiet mornings with coffee, carrying the hypothesis, lightly, playfully, that the very thing the mystics have been pointing at for thousands of years is not somewhere else, not reserved for saints and hermits and people with better posture than you, but is, in fact, right here, sitting exactly where you're sitting, looking out through exactly your eyes. Try it for a week. Notice what changes in how you treat the people who annoy you when you consider that whatever is looking out through their eyes